We're motoring, so punch your price for flight on NES Works episode 75. We have two sports-themed games this week, one very good and one very bad. I'd say which is a mystery, but the presence of the LJN logo on the packaging of one of them kind of spoils that gag. And speaking of gag, that's exactly what the second game is going to make you do, with a spoon. But first, let's talk about the good game. RC Pro-Am sees British developer Rare returning to their roots in some respects, while also forging new ground. Now at this point in NES history, Rare hadn't yet become the most prolific Western development house for the system, but this game is a great example of why so many publishers would go on to hire them to do their contract work.
This is by far the best racing game we've seen to date on the system. It's also the most technically impressive, and the most innovative. It's kind of a big deal. As a matter of fact, this was the first third-party release to be enshrined by Nintendo as a cover title for its in-house propaganda magazine and precursor to Nintendo Power, the Fun Club News. RC Pro-Am emblazoned the cover of the Fun Club issue 5, putting it in the same hallowed territory as Mike Tyson's Punch-Out!, Zelda 2, and Super Mario Bros. 2. Though technically, I suppose if you want to split hairs, this wasn't really a third-party title. As with Slalom, Rare designed the game for and published it under the label of Nintendo itself. This might not be immediately obvious, given the shift in box art seen here. Nintendo has officially retired their black box trade dress, even the silver ones. RC Pro-Am comes in a bright, colorful, painted box whose main tip-off to its first-party nature is the use of a bold, tilted Helvetica font for its title. Truly, we are into the second generation of NES here. And to mark the occasion, we have this groundbreaking racing game. Not unlike Slalom, RC Pro-Am takes a slightly unconventional approach to racing. Rather than tooling around the track in a hot rod or F1 car or motorcycle, you're controlling a remote control mini-car. It's such a great conceit, and it completely opens up the genre to new mechanics and new concepts. Despite being presented as a race by a set of tiny cars, RC Pro-Am doesn't lack for speed. It's a blazing fast racer, maybe not quite as fast as Rad Racer with its road rally intensity, but far more hectic. Because the player is cast here as someone steering a remote minicar, the game is able to dispense with the notion that you're supposed to be experiencing the race from within the car. In real life, you'd be racing miniatures from the sidelines rather than by sitting in the car, and that's exactly how RC Pro-Am presents the action. You control your car remotely, guiding it around the track from an external position. This adds an element of complexity to the controls because the NES D-pad is treated as if it were an RC remote here, which is to say the D-pad's cross doesn't map directly into the action. Instead, you control your car with fixed directions, as if RC Pro-Am were a racer viewed from behind the car. You hold B to accelerate, and press left or right to steer the car to its left or right, not necessarily in the direction that appears to be left or right on the screen. This sort of thing is pretty intuitive now, I think, but for kids in 1988, it took a little bit of mental adjustment to think in terms of the vehicle's movements rather than in literal visual terms of the screen layout.
Much as Gunsmoke felt like a showcase for the new NES Advantage controller, RC Pro-Am in some respects feels like a showcase for Nintendo's other new peripheral for 87-88, the NES Max. A strange little device whose D-pad was offset to a ring surrounding a free-floating thumb pad, the NES Max was pretty useless, generally speaking, for shooters and platformers.
But for something like RC Pro-Am, where your control scheme really wants to simulate a tiny steering wheel, it's pretty solid. The NES still didn't have a steering wheel peripheral by 1988, and actually it would never actually have one. So the Max had to do the trick. To simulate the perspective of standing by the side of a miniature track, looking down at a tiny car as it zips around, Rare played to their historic strengths. They gave the game an isometric viewpoint. Or maybe it's oblique projection, whatever. The point is, Rare made its mark on gaming with its isometric filmation creations for ZX Spectrum. That includes Night Lore, which we've seen a heavily modified version of on Metroidvania Works. RC Pro-Am goes back to that well, presenting its high-speed racing action from a 3/4 top-down perspective that gives everything a real sense of immersion, despite it being a simulation of a remote, detached racing experience. Obviously, Nintendo had used a forced perspective with Excitebike, but that game lacked turns. It pitched its track contours at 90-degree angles rather than 45, and it laid out its presumably circular tracks as an endless ribbon in a straight line. RC Pro-Am includes the turns and twists you'd expect from a top-down viewpoint. but they're presented here in a more three-dimensional style. This perspective would be widely imitated in the years to come, as seen in the Off-Road series. Unlike Off-Road though, RC Pro-Am isn't a single-screen game. The camera scrolls freely in all directions to keep the player's car front and center of tracks that ramble across spaces much larger than the span of the screen resolution. It's an impressive feat of programming at this point in the NES's life. We've seen just a handful of games that have included multi-directional scrolling, and the only one that moved as smoothly and fast as RC Pro-Am has been Wizards and Warriors, which, not coincidentally, also hailed from Rare. Were RC Pro-Am simply a fast racer with a novel premise and impressive tech, it would be a standout release for NES. What puts it over the top is the addition of combat elements. This is the point at which RC Pro-Am abandons all pretense of being a realistic, remote-control racing simulation and goes all in on just being really damn fun. And challenging. Scattered across each track, you'll find a random selection of parts, weapons, and power-ups that you and your competitors can collect by driving over them. Parts like tires and engines enhance the performance of your racer, not temporarily, but as a permanent upgrade. Drive over an engine block, and your car's top speed will be increased for the remainder of the game. You can acquire temporary boosts as well, such as roll bars that make you invincible. But the real treasures here are the weapons, the bombs and missiles, which become a part of your car's arsenal. Collect a pot of missiles and you can blast a racer directly ahead of you. Pick up some bombs and you can litter the road behind your car with explosives that'll derail any tailgaters. The combat element here, while hardly immersive or deep, gives RC Pro-Am that little extra edge that takes it from great game to actual classic. It's not a perfect game, but as 8-bit racers go, this was like nothing else on the market. And you can see its fingerprints all over the genre. Besides the many isometric racers to descend from it, it's hard not to see RC Pro-Am's influence in Super Mario Kart and its offspring. You know, that combat racing game from RC Pro-Am publisher Nintendo. In turn, RC Pro-Am probably owes a tremendous debt to Electronic Arts' 1985 computer hit Racing Destruction Set. That game broke all kinds of ground with its isometric perspective, track-building construction tool, and aggressive combat-centric action. RC Pro-Am is a brilliant console-style distillation of Racing Destruction Set, featuring bigger and bolder graphics, faster action, smoother scrolling, and fun new mechanics for combat. Not unlike the way RC Pro-Am is a clever, console-oriented adaptation of Rare's trademark graphical style.
And on the other hand, there's T&C Surf Design. If RC Pro-Am is a timeless, innovative, inventive game that still is enjoyable to play even to this day, T&C Surf Design definitely is not.
Like Karate Kid, this is another Atlas LJN joint venture, and as everything we've seen from LJN, this is a licensed game. Unlike Jaws, which is an iconic work, or Karate Kid, which is somehow more popular than ever in the year 2021, T&C Surf Design is not based on a timeless eternal license. It is truly a creation for a very specific moment in time, namely the late 80s, during that very brief flash of national obsession with surf culture. T&C Surf Design was and is a Hawaii-based surf brand established back in the early 70s. When surf mania hit in the late 80s, their brand, defined by a yin-yang emblem, became briefly inescapable. It wasn't really the brand name or the mystic symbol that made T&C such a big deal, though. It was their coterie of Steve Nazar-designed mascot characters, collectively known as Da Boys, who had been designed as a sort of comical lifestyle concept. Da Boys showed up on posters, decks, t-shirts, and in video games. Basically, T&C Surf Design for NES is a shallow attempt to rip off Epyx's California games by turning it into a mascot action game. The wood and water rage of the title comes from the fact that the game contains a whopping 2 events. There's wood, in which you skateboard down a boardwalk, and there's water, where you surf a halfpipe. Neither one is especially good. However, each one lets you play as different members of Da Boys, which I guess someone decided was sufficient to carry a watered-down adaptation of an Epyx computer hit. The music is good, and the graphics are okay, but the play controls are stiff, the surf event is tepid, and there's just not much to do here. Honestly, it's hard to see Atlas's track record to this point and think this company would ever amount to anything. And LJN too, but that's kind of a given. The most notable thing to say about T&C Surf Design is that it kicks off a string of tragically mediocre games for NES. 1987 ended well, and 1988 started with so much promise. But all those crummy, bin-filler NES games, you have to wade through at retro gaming convention sales booths. have to show up sometime. And that time is over the next few episodes. Please look forward to it, or more likely, don't.
Next time on NES Works, if I had 7 Dragon Balls, I'd simply wish for this game not to exist.